When the Raven crew decided to target St. Michael's Church in the quiet town of New Haven Falls, they had no idea they were about to cross paths with the most feared bounty hunter east of the Mississippi, a legend who'd once been known as the Shepherd for how he'd guided criminals straight to justice's gate. A man whose real name hadn't been spoken in criminal circles for over a decade, but whose legacy still caused hardened felons to check their shadows on dark nights. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next in that small Connecticut town would be whispered about in prison cells for years to come. Father Thomas Reeves hadn't chosen New Haven Falls for any particular reason. After 20 years of hunting, the worst humanity had to offer, he'd simply pointed his car north from New York City and driven until he found a place that felt quiet enough to heal his soul. The small town nestled in the Berkshire foothills, with its population of just under 5,000, seemed as good a place as any to honor the promise he'd made to his dying mentor, to find purpose beyond the hunt. The old stone church sat on a hilltop overlooking Main Street, its weathered spire a constant presence in the lives of the townspeople below. Father Thomas had arrived 5 years ago, his silver-streaked dark hair and scarred hands telling stories he never shared. The parish council had been desperate enough for a new priest that they didn't ask too many questions about his past. And he proved to be exactly what the struggling congregation needed: patient, wise, and carrying an air of quiet authority that drew people in despite themselves. What the good people of New Haven Falls didn't know was that their soft-spoken priest kept more than just Bibles in his study. Behind the ancient oak panels, carefully maintained and never far from reach, lay the tools of his former trade, including a custom Sig Sauer P226 with professionally modified sights and a grip worn smooth by years of use. The gun, like the man who owned it, had been officially retired but remained vigilant. The October evening that would change everything started like any other, with Father Thomas locking up after evening prayers. The autumn air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke as he made his final rounds, checking doors and windows with a thoroughness that spoke of ingrained habits rather than simple caution. His heavy black coat, cut slightly fuller than strictly necessary for a man of the cloth, concealed both his weapon and the lean muscle that years of peace hadn't entirely softened. Downtown, the Raven crew was making their final preparations. They'd spent weeks casing the church, watching the comings and goings, noting delivery schedules and security patterns. They'd chosen St. Michael's carefully. Old churches like this often held valuable artifacts, and this one had recently received a generous donation of religious art from a wealthy patron's estate. More importantly, their surveillance suggested minimal security beyond basic locks, and an elderly priest who spent too much time helping the homeless to pose any real threat. Marcus Raven Blackwood sat in his matte black SUV, parked in the shadows of the town's small shopping district, and studied the satellite view on his tablet one final time. At 45, he'd spent more than half his life building a reputation for meticulous planning and brutal efficiency. His crew of 7 had pulled off similar heists up and down the eastern seaboard, their signature black tactical gear and bird skull masks becoming something of an urban legend in law enforcement circles. "Everything's set," Crow, his second-in-command, reported over their encrypted channel. "Teams in position. Old man's doing his usual rounds before heading to the rectory." Raven's scarred fingers traced the planned entry routes on his screen. "Remember, we want this quiet. In and out in 20 minutes. The donation ledger shows at least 4 pieces worth mid-6 figures each, plus whatever's in the safe. No witnesses, no complications." What Raven didn't know, couldn't know, was that Father Thomas had already spotted signs of their surveillance weeks ago. He'd noticed the same vehicles appearing at odd hours, the subtle disturbances in the church grounds each morning, the way certain members of his congregation had been asked casual but specific questions about the church's routine. Details that would have seemed innocent to most, but to a man who'd spent decades hunting predators, they might as well have been neon signs. The priest hadn't survived 20 years of bringing in the worst of the worst by ignoring his instincts. He'd made his preparations quietly, modified his routines just enough to project vulnerability while ensuring he maintained tactical advantages. He'd also done his research, recognizing the patterns from similar heists up the coast. The Raven crew had a reputation for efficiency, but also for unnecessary violence. 3 security guards died in their last job, a janitor left paralyzed. In the one before that, as Father Thomas completed his rounds, his practiced eyes caught the subtle signs of movement in the shadows near the church's side entrance. Through the stained glass windows, filtered streetlights created pools of colored shadows across the ancient stone floors. He paused near the altar, ostensibly to straighten a hymnal, while his trained senses catalogued positions and movements. At least 3 figures approaching the west door, another 2 near the office entrance, more likely watching the perimeter. Inside his coat, the familiar weight of his Sig Sauer pressed against his ribs. The weapon was a reminder of the life he'd left behind, of promises made both to his mentor and to himself. He'd sworn to leave that world of violence and retribution, to find a different way to serve justice and help his fellow man. But he'd also sworn to protect his flock, and sometimes, as his old mentor used to say, the good Lord works in mysterious ways. Young Michael Chen, who helped maintain the church grounds, had noticed Father Thomas's tension over the past week. The boy was more observant than most, perhaps because his own father had been a police officer before dying in the line of duty 2 years ago. That afternoon, he'd finally worked up the courage to ask the priest if something was wrong. "Just thinking about the nature of redemption, Michael," Father Thomas had replied, his steel-grey eyes scanning the tree line even as they spoke. "About how sometimes the path to grace requires us to face the darkness we thought we'd left behind." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight behind the words. "My dad used to say that sometimes good people have to stand up to bad people, even when they'd rather not." A ghost of a smile had touched the priest's weathered features. "Your father was a wise man, Michael. Why don't you head home early today, and perhaps mention to your mother that tonight might be a good night to catch up on those cooking shows she enjoys so much." Now, as the autumn night settled over New Haven Falls like a velvet blanket, Father Thomas moved quietly through his church's shadowed interior. His posture had shifted subtly, the pastoral gentleness giving way to something more primal, the focused alertness of a predator preparing to protect its territory. The soft soles of his shoes made no sound on the stone floor as he positioned himself in the deepest shadows near the altar. Through the windows, he could see more dark figures approaching, their movements disciplined and coordinated. Professional work, but with an underlying arrogance that experience told him could be turned to his advantage. They thought they were hunting easy prey, an old priest in an unprotected church. They were about to learn what his former quarries had discovered the hard way. Sometimes the shepherd carried more than just a staff to protect his flock. The night air grew colder as clouds rolled in, obscuring the waning moon. New Haven Falls had grown quiet, most of its residents already tucked away in their homes, unaware of the drama about to unfold in their beloved church. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through autumn leaves and the distant rumble of a freight train passing through the valley below. Sarah Chen, Michael's mother, and the church's administrative assistant had taken her son's cryptic message seriously. She'd known Father Thomas long enough to recognize when the former bounty hunter's instincts were stirring. Something in the priest's demeanor over the past weeks had reminded her of her late husband in the days before a major operation. That same coiled tension, that same careful attention to detail. From her home overlooking the church, Sarah watched as dark figures moved through the shadows of the parish grounds. Her hand hovered over her phone, Father Thomas's instructions clear in her mind. If anything seems wrong tonight, call Agent Diana Morrison at the FBI's New Haven office. Tell her the shepherd sends his regards. She'll understand. Inside the church, Father Thomas moved silently through the familiar space that had been his sanctuary for the past 5 years. The ancient stones seemed to whisper to him, their centuries-old vigilance matching his own. He'd chosen his position. Carefully, the elevated choir loft offered clear sightlines of both main entrances, while the ornate wooden screening provided perfect concealment. In his earpiece, a reminder of the modern touches he'd quietly added to the historic building. He could hear the subtle electronic chirps that told him the motion sensors were being triggered one by one. The Raven crew was good, he had to admit. Their approach was methodical, professional, but they'd made one critical mistake. They assumed that robbing a church was merely a logistical challenge, not understanding that some sacred spaces carried secrets darker than their own. Through the stained glass, Father Thomas caught glimpses of the intruders' movements. Their black tactical gear and bird skull masks might intimidate common security guards, but to his experienced eye, they told a story of their own. The way they moved, the formation they kept. Military training, probably private military contractors gone rogue. That explained their efficiency and their brutality. Among the shadows, he recognized Raven himself, the crew's leader. The FBI's file on Marcus Raven Blackwood was extensive. Former Force Recon Marine, dishonorable discharge after an incident in Iraq that remained heavily redacted. The man had spent the past decade building his criminal enterprise, each heist more ambitious than the last. But there was something different about this one. A personal edge to the planning that suggested more than simple profit motive. Father Thomas's suspicions were confirmed when he caught fragments of their encrypted communications through the scanner hidden in his study. They weren't just here for the valuable artifacts, they were looking for something specific, something hidden within the church's historic structure. Primary team, move in, Raven's voice crackled through the night. Remember, check the altar. First, intelligence suggests that's where they usually hide the high-value items. As if in answer to the coming violence, the wind picked up outside, rattling the ancient windows. Father Thomas touched the cross hanging at his neck, not the simple wooden one he wore during services, but a silver crucifix that concealed a razor-sharp blade. Another remnant of his former life, like the scarred knuckles he kept hidden beneath. His sleeves or the multiple passports sealed behind the rectory walls. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lord, he whispered, his voice barely a breath in the darkness. Forgive me for what I must do, and may these men be smart enough to walk away when given the chance. But even as he prayed, he knew they wouldn't. Men like the Raven crew didn't walk away, didn't leave witnesses. They had their reputation to maintain, after all, just as he had his own promises to keep, not just to his mentor or his congregation, but to the very notion of sanctuary itself. In a world growing darker by the day, some lines had to be held, some spaces kept sacred. The first lock clicked softly as the intruders began their entry. Father Thomas remained motionless in his concealed position, watching as the shadows within shadows took human form. Years of experience had taught him the value of patience, of letting events unfold according to their own rhythm. The Raven crew was about to learn what others had discovered before them, that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one that waited in perfect stillness, watching until the precise moment to strike. New Haven Falls had always been the kind of town that appeared frozen in time, its maple-lined streets and historic buildings looking much as they had a century ago. St. Michael's Church stood as its crown jewel, the Gothic Revival structures, weathered stones holding nearly 200 years of local history. But like the priest who now served as its guardian, the peaceful facade concealed layers of complexity that few suspected. Detective Claire Morrison of the New Haven Falls Police Department sat in her unmarked car 2 blocks from the church, nursing a cooling coffee and monitoring the police band with growing unease. She'd known Father Thomas for the past 3 years, ever since he'd helped her track down a teenager who'd stolen collection money to feed his younger siblings. Instead of pressing charges, the priest had found the boy's family assistance and given him a job maintaining the church grounds. That incident had sparked Claire's curiosity about the unusual priest. Her investigative instincts, honed by 15 years on the force, told her there was more to Father Thomas than his gentle demeanor suggested. The way he moved, the way his eyes constantly tracked exits and entrances, the way he seemed to know about troubles in town before they happened, all spoke of a background far removed from seminary studies. "Car 3, what's your status?" Her radio crackled. "Still quiet on Church Street," she responded, while watching another black-clad figure slip between the shadows of the parish hall. "No disturbances to report." The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but she trusted Father Thomas's judgment. Earlier that day, he'd visited her office, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming Community Safety Council meeting. His real message had been brief but clear. "Tonight, no matter what you hear, keep your patrols away from St. Michael's unless I specifically call. Some lost sheep are about to wander into the fold, and they'll need a very particular kind of guidance." The cryptic warning had been accompanied by a sealed envelope, to be opened only if something went wrong. Inside, Claire knew she would find answers to the questions she'd been too respectful to ask about the priest's past. She hoped she wouldn't need to open it. Inside St. Michael's, the Raven crew was executing their plan with practiced precision. Crow, his bird skull mask gleaming dully in the darkness, led 2 men toward the church office, while Raven himself headed for the altar with 3 others. Their bootsteps, despite their careful movement, echoed softly off the ancient stones. Security. "Systems basic," Crow reported through their encrypted channel. "No cameras inside the main sanctuary, motion sensors at entry points only, already looped." What he couldn't know was that the system he'd detected was merely a decoy. The real security measures installed gradually over the past 5 years were far more sophisticated. Father Thomas watched through his thermal imaging display as the heat signatures of the intruders moved through his church. Each step they took triggered silent alerts, building a precise picture of their movements. From his concealed position, he could hear fragments of their whispered conversations. Their professionalism was starting to fray around the edges, something about the church's shadows setting them on edge. These men were used to operating in modern buildings with clear sightlines and predictable layouts. The historic church, with its Gothic arches and deep shadows, played tricks with sound and light that their tactical training hadn't prepared them for. "Check the reliquary behind the altar," Raven commanded. "According to the intel, that's where they keep the most valuable pieces." Father Thomas's lips curved in a grim smile. He knew exactly what they were looking for. The Salzburg reliquary, recently donated by the estate of a wealthy parishioner. The ornate golden container was indeed valuable, but its true worth wasn't in its materials or craftsmanship. Inside, hidden in a secret compartment that even the donors hadn't known about, was something far more precious. A ledger containing account numbers and client lists from a massive money laundering operation. "Good from the preparations we made, from the very walls of this church," He gestured to the ancient stones around them. Sacred spaces have their own kind of strength. Sometimes they just need someone willing to channel it. Agent Morrison, overhearing. This raised an eyebrow. That's not going in my official report. No, Father Thomas agreed with that ghost of a smile. I expect your report will focus on how an experienced tactical response team acting on anonymous intelligence intercepted a known criminal crew attempting to rob a historic church. Much neater that way. And the smoke, the shadows, the way 6 highly trained criminals were systematically dismantled by what appeared to be a single opponent? Sometimes, he replied quietly, the official record has to leave room for mystery. After all, isn't that part of what faith is about? Detective Claire Morrison was coordinating with the forensics team when she noticed something odd. Despite the number of shots fired, despite the chaos of the confrontation, there was remarkably little actual damage to the church's important features. The bullet holes seemed to have found only solid stone, avoiding the precious stained glass, and irreplaceable artifacts, almost as if they were guided, she murmured. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Father Thomas said from behind her, somehow moving silently despite the debris-strewn floor. Though, in this case, he may have had help from some carefully placed ballistic panels and strategic lighting designed to encourage specific firing angles. You really did turn this whole church into a tactical setup, she said, admiring the ingenuity. But why? Why stay here as a priest when you could have just moved on, found another cover? Because it's not a cover, he replied, his voice taking on that deeper resonance that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the soul. Everything I've done here, the counseling, the community service, the early morning prayers and late-night vigils, it's all real. The tactical preparations were just an extension of my duty to protect this sanctuary and its people. One of the FBI evidence technicians approached, carefully carrying the reliquary. Sir, Father, where would you like us to process? This, the sacristy, Father Thomas directed. Agent Morrison knows the protocols for handling sacred artifacts. Though I suspect, he added with a meaningful look at Diana, the most sensitive contents have already been secured through appropriate channels. Diana nodded slightly. 3 copies of the ledger were already en route to secure locations, its explosive contents soon to send shockwaves through corridors of power across the country. But that would be another kind of battle, fought with subpoenas and testimony rather than smoke and shadows. As the morning progressed, New Haven Falls began to wake up to the news that something significant had happened at St. Michael's. Parishioners gathered at the police cordon, their faces showing concern that turned to relief when they saw Father Thomas moving calmly through the chaos, offering reassurance and guidance as naturally as if this were any other morning. You've built something special here, Agent Morrison observed, watching him interact with his congregation. Something that goes beyond your old life or your new one. Something that combines both. We all have multiple callings, he replied thoughtfully. The trick is finding ways to honor them all without compromising any. Tonight, he gestured to the scene around them, where federal agents worked alongside local police to document a confrontation that defied easy explanation. Tonight was about showing that justice and mercy aren't opposing forces. They're 2 sides of the same divine coin. Sarah Chen, who had been coordinating with the cleanup crew, approached with a puzzled expression. Father, some of the workers are asking about the incense. They say it's still affecting them, making them feel peaceful, contemplative. A few have asked about confession times. That ghost of a smile returned to Father Thomas's features. The formula is an old one, part monastery secret, part tactical compound, designed not just to disorient, but to open the mind to deeper considerations. I suspect we'll be having some interesting conversations in the confessional this week. Only you, Diana said with a mixture of admiration and exasperation, would turn a tactical takedown into a spiritual awakening opportunity. Why not? He responded, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the strengthening morning light. After all, isn't that what redemption is about? Finding light in darkness, purpose in chaos, grace in unexpected places. He touched the cross at his neck, the silver gleaming with both battle scars and divine purpose. Even wolves can find their way to the shepherd's flock if someone is willing to guide them through the darkness. As the sun climbed higher over New Haven Falls, St. Michael's Church began its transformation back into a simple house of worship. The tactical gear was catalogued and removed, the sophisticated equipment concealed once more behind ancient panels, the signs of conflict slowly erased by careful hands. But something had changed, not just in the physical space, but in the very air itself. The old stones seemed to hum with renewed purpose, as if the night's events had awakened something long dormant in their consecrated core. Father Thomas watched. It all with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had fulfilled multiple duties at once, protector and priest, warrior and shepherd, instrument of both justice and mercy. The coming days would bring challenges, questions from his superiors, attention from unwanted quarters, souls in need of guidance, both spiritual and practical. But for now, in the growing light of a new day, he allowed himself to simply be present. In this space where two worlds had collided and found an unexpected harmony. Mysterious ways indeed, he whispered, his voice carrying just a hint of that otherworldly resonance that had so terrified the Raven crew. Above him, the morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows, creating patterns that, just for a moment, looked remarkably like wings. The week following the confrontation at St. Michael's brought changes both subtle and profound to New Haven Falls. While FBI teams quietly processed evidence and prepared indictments, life in the small town took on a surreal quality. Parishioners whispered about the bullet holes being patched in the church walls, while local news outlets ran vague stories about an attempted robbery thwarted by alert law enforcement. Father Thomas maintained his usual routines, morning prayers, counseling sessions, community outreach, but those who knew him best could sense a shift. The careful balance between his two natures, priest and protector, had been temporarily disrupted, leaving him more vigilant, more present, more aware of the delicate line he walked between his past and present lives. "You're hovering again," Sarah Chen observed one morning, finding him conducting yet another security sweep of the church grounds. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. "The FBI said the threat is contained. Raven's organization is in chaos, their leadership scattered." "Old habits," he replied, his steel-grey eyes scanning the tree line even as he smiled. "Though, in my experience, chaos often breeds desperate actions. Better to remain watchful." Sarah studied him thoughtfully, noting how his priest's coat still hung slightly fuller on one side, concealing the weapon he hadn't stopped carrying since the incident. "Michael's been asking questions," she said quietly. "About you, about what really happened that night. He's piecing things together." "Father." Thomas paused in his scan, turning to face her fully. "What kind of questions?" "About the shepherd, about why someone with your particular set of skills would choose to become a priest in a small town, about whether his father might have known who you really were." The mention of Michael's father, Officer James Chen, brought a shadow of old pain to Father Thomas's features. James had been one of the few who'd known his true identity, had helped him establish his cover when he'd first arrived in New Haven Falls. The officer's death 2 years ago in what had appeared to be a routine traffic stop had never sat right with either of them. "Perhaps it's time for some truth," Father Thomas said softly. "Not all of it. He's not ready for that burden yet. But enough to help him understand that his father was part of something greater than himself." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Claire Morrison, her unmarked car pulling up to the church with unusual urgency. "We need to talk," she said as she approached, her expression grave. "Something's happening with the Raven Crew cases. Witnesses are recanting, evidence is disappearing, and 2 of the prisoners, including Crow, have escaped federal custody." Father Thomas's posture shifted subtly, the pastoral calm giving way to tactical awareness. "Not escaped," he corrected. "Released. Someone with significant influence is trying to contain the situation." "You mean the people mentioned in the ledger?" Sarah asked, her quick mind connecting the dots. "The ones who used churches for money laundering, among others." Father Thomas gestured for them to follow him inside. The morning sun streamed through the repaired stained glass windows, creating pools of colored light that seemed to move with purposeful intention across the ancient stones. "The evidence we recovered poses a threat to people in very high places. People who view places like this as nothing more than convenient fronts for their operations." Inside his study, the priest pressed a hidden panel, revealing a sophisticated computer setup that seemed at odds with the room's otherwise traditional appearance. Multiple screens displayed news feeds, police reports, and surveillance footage from around the town. "I've been monitoring chatter since the incident," he explained, bringing up several windows of encrypted data. "There's movement in certain circles, money being shifted, arrangements being made. They're not just trying to protect themselves from exposure. They're planning something." Claire leaned in, her investigator's instincts triggered by what she saw. "These financial transfers, they're similar to patterns we saw before previous Raven Crew operations, but the amounts are much larger." "Because this isn't just about one crew anymore," Father Thomas said grimly. "They're hiring multiple teams, pooling resources, making sure that this time they don't underestimate what they're dealing with." Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to the cross she wore, a gift from Father Thomas, though she now suspected it might contain more than just spiritual protection. "You think they'll come here again, after what happened last time?" "Last time they thought they were dealing with a simple priest and an unprotected church," he replied, his voice taking on that deeper resonance that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the soul. "This time they know exactly who and what they're facing." As if in response to his words, one of the screens lit up with an alert. A facial recognition program had identified Crow at a private airfield 2 states over, meeting with figures whose profiles set off multiple federal watchlist warnings. "They're gathering," Father Thomas said softly, his hand unconsciously moving to the weapon concealed beneath his coat. "Like wolves circling a flock. But they've forgotten something important about shepherds." "What's that?" Claire asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "A good shepherd doesn't just protect his flock," he replied, his steel-grey eyes reflecting the light from the screens. "He prepares for the wolves' return. And sometimes," that ghost of a smile touched his features, "he prepares the wolves for redemption, whether they seek it or not." Sarah studied the man who had been both savior and mystery to their community. "What do you need us to do?" "What you've already been doing," he answered, starting to shut down the surveillance systems. "Be vigilant, be prepared, but maintain normalcy. They'll be watching for signs of preparation, for any indication that we know they're coming. Let them think the church has returned to its quiet routine, while in reality," Claire prompted, "in reality, we remind them why sacred spaces have always been places of both sanctuary and power, why true strength often lies in the perfect balance between mercy and justice." He touched the silver crucifix at his neck, which seemed to gleam. with both battle scars and divine purpose. And perhaps most importantly, we remind them that some shepherds are called to guard their flocks by any means necessary. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, creating patterns that seemed to move with deliberate purpose across the ancient stones. Outside, New Haven Falls went about its business, unaware of the forces gathering in the shadows. But within St. Michael's Church, preparations of both a tactical and spiritual nature were quietly beginning. Father Thomas knew that the coming confrontation would be different from the last. The enemy would be better prepared, more numerous, more desperate. But so would he, because this time it wasn't just about protecting physical assets or exposing criminal enterprises. It was about defending the very concept of sanctuary itself, about proving that even in the modern world, some spaces remained sacred for a reason. "You know," Claire observed as they began to discuss specific security measures, "most priests just have to worry about Sunday sermons and bake sales." That ghost of a smile returned to Father Thomas's weathered features. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, detective. Sometimes he calls us to unconventional forms of ministry. And sometimes," he added, his voice carrying just a hint of that otherworldly resonance that had so terrified the Raven crew, "he reminds us that the battle between light and darkness takes many forms." As they talked, the autumn wind picked up, outside, carrying with it the first hints of the storm to come. But within the church's ancient walls, a different kind of preparation was underway, one that would combine modern tactical precision with ancient sacred purpose in ways that their enemies couldn't begin to imagine. The wolves were indeed gathering, but this time the shepherd and his allies would be ready for them. And perhaps, just perhaps, some of those wolves would find themselves on an unexpected path to redemption, whether they wanted it or not. Later that afternoon, Michael Chen arrived for his usual maintenance duties to find Father Thomas in the church basement, moving aside ancient storage boxes to reveal sophisticated security equipment concealed within the stone walls. The young man paused in the doorway, his expression a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. "What are they talking about that night? About how you moved like a shadow, how the darkness itself seemed to help you?" Father Thomas straightened up, studying the boy thoughtfully. In Michael's eyes, he saw the same hunger for truth that had once burned in his own, back before he'd learned that some truths come with heavy burdens attached. "Come here," he said, gesturing to a worn wooden bench near the wall. "It's time we talked about your father." Michael sat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. She said Dad helped you when you first came here, that he knew who you really were." "James Chen was a rare kind of man," Father Thomas said softly, his steel-grey eyes distant with memory, the kind who could see past appearances to the truth beneath. "When I arrived in New Haven Falls, looking for a quiet place to honor a promise made to my dying mentor, your father was the first to recognize what I was, and more importantly, what I was trying to become." "What was that?" "Something more than just a warrior, something more than just a priest, someone who could bridge the gap between justice and mercy, between the physical battle and the spiritual one." He touched the silver crucifix at his neck. "Your father understood that sometimes protecting people requires more than just a badge and a gun. Sometimes it requires faith, wisdom, and the courage to walk in both light and shadow." Upstairs, they could hear Sarah and Detective Morrison continuing their security preparations. The sound of power tools suggested they were installing some of the new equipment Father Thomas had quietly acquired since the Raven crew's attack. "That night," Michael said hesitantly, "when Dad died, it wasn't really a routine traffic stop, was it?" Father Thomas's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "No," he admitted. He'd discovered something, connections between certain local businesses and the same organization that employed the Raven crew. He came to me first, knowing my background, wanting to make sure we had solid evidence before moving forward. But they found out. They usually do. But your father—" Father Thomas's voice carried a deep respect. "Your father made sure the evidence reached the right people before they could stop him. His sacrifice helped expose a major operation, saved countless lives. He died protecting this community in more ways than most people will ever know." Michael absorbed this in silence, his young face showing the weight of understanding. And now they're coming back. The people he was fighting against? "They're trying," Father Thomas confirmed, "but this time we're better prepared. This time we have something they don't understand, a community united in purpose, in faith, and in the determination to protect what's sacred." As if to emphasize his point, Agent Diana Morrison chose that moment to descend the basement stairs, carrying several cases of what appeared to be standard church supplies, but which both priest and boy recognized as cleverly disguised tactical gear. "Latest shipment from our friends at the Bureau," she announced, then paused upon seeing Michael. "Ah, having that talk, are we?" "Time he knew the truth," Father Thomas replied. "Or at least as much of it as he's ready for." Diana set down her cases and studied Michael with professional interest. "You know, your father helped us too. Fed us information about local connections to larger criminal enterprises. He had a way of seeing patterns others missed, just like his son," Father Thomas added with that ghost of a smile. "I haven't missed how you've been cataloguing changes in town, Michael. The new businesses that seem to appear overnight, the strangers asking questions about the church, the vehicles that pass by just a little too regularly." Michael straightened up, surprised and pleased at the recognition. I just notice things, like Dad taught me." Father Thomas rose smoothly, his priest's coat swirling with that same impossible grace that had so unnerved the Raven crew. "Then it's time to prepare in earnest. Michael, if you're in, I'll need you to help coordinate with the younger members of the congregation. Set up those extra security cameras we disguised as renovation equipment." Michael stood as well, his bearing unconsciously straightening to match the priest's. "I'm in," he said firmly. "For Dad, for the church, for everything it stands for." "Good man," Father Thomas replied softly. "But remember, our greatest strength isn't in our preparations or our tactics. It's in our faith, our community, and our understanding that true protection comes from a balance of physical and spiritual readiness." As they ascended the stairs back into the main church, the late afternoon sun was streaming through the stained glass windows, creating patterns that seemed to move with deliberate purpose. The ancient stones hummed with an energy that was part tactical preparation, part sacred purpose, and part something else entirely, something that defied easy explanation. "You know what I've learned in my years of hunting darkness?" Father Thomas said as they reached the sanctuary. "Evil fears nothing more than a light that refuses to be extinguished. And this light," he gestured to the church around them, where modern security seamlessly merged with ancient sanctity, "this light has been burning for centuries. Our job is simply to keep it burning by whatever means necessary." Diana watched this exchange with professional interest, noting how naturally Father Thomas balanced his roles as mentor, protector, and spiritual guide. "Sometimes I wonder," she mused, "if this isn't what you were always meant to be, not just a warrior or just a priest, but something that transcends both." That ghost of a smile touched his weathered features. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Agent Morrison. Sometimes the path of redemption leads us not to an either-or, but to a both-and. Speaking of which," he turned to Sarah, "I believe it's time for evening prayers, best to maintain our normal routines, even as we prepare for whatever comes next." The small group dispersed to their various tasks, Diana to coordinate with her federal contacts, Sarah to manage the church's public face, Michael to begin his new role as junior guardian of the sanctuary. But Father Thomas lingered for a moment in the growing darkness, his steel-grey eyes reflecting both tactical awareness and spiritual purpose. The wolves were indeed gathering, drawn by the light they sought to extinguish. But this time, they would find more than just an old church with a quiet priest. They would find a sanctuary prepared to defend itself, a community ready to stand together, and a shepherd whose methods of guidance sometimes required a firmer hand than most might expect. In the deepening twilight, the church's ancient stones seemed to pulse with renewed purpose, as if awakening to the coming challenge. And somewhere in the gathering shadows, a silver crucifix gleamed with both battle scars and divine promise, ready for whatever the darkness might bring. As evening prayers began, familiar faces filled the pews, though now, with his new understanding, Michael noticed things he hadn't before. Mrs. Rodriguez, who always sat in the third row, carried herself with the precise posture of someone with military training. Mr. Patterson, the elderly groundskeeper, moved with a deliberate awareness that spoke of more than just years tending the church gardens. "Your father helped build this," Father Thomas said quietly as they prepared the altar candles. "Not just the security network, but the community itself." He understood that true strength comes from people working together, each contributing their own unique skills and experiences. The priest's words were interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Marcus Wade, the local mechanic, entered quietly through the side door, his prosthetic arm gleaming dully in the candlelight. He made his way directly to Father Thomas, his grave. "Got movement down at the rail yard," he reported in a low voice. "New crews coming in on the freight trains." Professional types trying hard to look casual and failing. Father Thomas nodded, unsurprised. "They're staging their pieces, trying to surround us without drawing attention." "How many?" "Dozen so far, maybe more coming. Some of them—" Marcus hesitated. "Some of them are wearing crosses, using church groups as cover." The priest's expression darkened slightly. "Corruption of the sacred. It's always been their way." He turned to Michael. "This is why we prepare, not just with tactics and technology, but with knowledge and faith. Evil often wears a familiar face." Diana Morrison appeared from the sacristy, where she'd been coordinating with her FBI contacts. "Got confirmation on some of our new arrivals," she reported. "Former military contractors, some with connections to religious extremist groups. They're building quite the coalition." "Because this isn't just about the ledger anymore," Father Thomas replied, his voice carrying that deeper resonance that seemed to echo off the ancient stones. "It's about sending a message. They want to prove that nothing is truly sacred, that everything and everyone has a price." Sarah Chen emerged from the church office, tablet in hand. Social media's picking up chatter. Lot of new accounts suddenly interested in St. Michael's history, asking about renovation schedules, service times. "They're mapping our patterns." "Let them," Father Thomas said with that ghost of a smile. "Sometimes the best defense is to let your enemy think they know more than they do." He turned to Michael. "Remember what I told you about your father's gift for seeing patterns? Time to put that inherited talent to use." The boy nodded eagerly. "What do you need?" "Work with Marcus. Document every new face in town, every unusual vehicle, every pattern that doesn't fit. But," his steel-grey eyes held Michael's gaze firmly, "do it quietly. Let them think they're observing us while we observe them." Detective Claire Morrison arrived as evening prayers were ending, bringing news from the police department. "Chiefs noticed the influx of strangers. He's talking about increasing patrols around the church." "Discourage him," Father Thomas advised. "The last thing we need is uniformed officers in the crossfire. This needs to be handled differently." "Like last time?" Claire asked. remembering the strange smoke, the impossible shadows, the way the very church itself had seemed to come alive during the confrontation with the Raven crew. Similar principles, different application, the priest replied. They'll be expecting those tactics now. We need to show them something new. He turned to address the small group gathered around him. Each of you has a part to play in what's coming. Some visible, some hidden, all essential. Like a church itself, Michael observed thoughtfully. Different parts working together, some seen, some unseen, but all part of the whole. Father Thomas's expression softened with approval. Exactly. Your father would be proud of that insight. He moved toward the altar, his movements holding that fluid grace that suggested both tactical training and spiritual purpose. We have 3 primary tasks ahead of us. First, gather intelligence. Know our enemy better than they know themselves. Second, prepare our defenses, both physical and otherwise. And third, his voice took on that otherworldly resonance, remind them why sacred spaces have endured throughout history, despite all attempts to corrupt or destroy them. Sarah studied the priest thoughtfully. You knew this would happen, didn't you? When you first came here, when you started building all this, you knew they'd eventually find you. I knew there was a possibility, he admitted. Which is why everything we've done, the security systems, the community building, the integration of old wisdom and new technology, has been about creating something that could withstand any storm. A true sanctuary, capable of defending itself and its people. And the ledger, Diana asked. The one they're really after? Safe, Father Thomas replied simply. Though its contents have already begun their work, even now certain powerful people are discovering that their carefully hidden secrets aren't so hidden anymore. Their response, he gestured to the evidence, of gathering enemies is predictable but ultimately futile. Michael, who had been thinking deeply about everything he'd learned, spoke up. You said Dad died protecting this community, that he discovered something they wanted to keep hidden. Yes. Father Thomas's expression held both sadness and pride. He found one piece of the puzzle they're still trying to contain. His sacrifice helped lead us to the larger truth, the network of corruption using churches and charities to hide their operations. And now they're coming to silence the last witness, Claire concluded, to destroy the evidence and make an example of anyone who dares to stand against them. They're welcome to try, Father Thomas said quietly, that ghost of a smile touching his features. But they'll find that this sanctuary holds more than just prayers and hymns. It holds centuries of faith, generations of hope, and a commitment to protecting what's sacred that goes beyond mere physical defense. As if in response to his words, the evening light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to intensify, creating patterns that moved with deliberate purpose across the ancient stones. The air itself felt charged with potential, as if the very space was awakening to the coming challenge. Time to begin in earnest, Father Thomas announced, moving toward his study. Michael, work with Marcus on surveillance. Sarah, coordinate with our community network. Diana, Claire, you know what information we need. And remember, he paused, his steel-grey eyes reflecting both tactical awareness and spiritual purpose. What we're protecting here isn't just a building or even a community. We're protecting the very idea that some things remain sacred, some lights refuse to be extinguished, some truths endure despite all attempts to bury them. As the group dispersed, to their tasks the ancient church bells began to toll, their deep tones carrying across New Haven Falls like a declaration of defiance. The coming storm might be gathering strength, but this time the sanctuary and its guardians would be ready, armed with both modern tactics and ancient wisdom, prepared to defend the sacred by any means necessary. And at the heart of it all, a priest who was also a warrior, a shepherd who was also a hunter, stood ready to remind their enemies why, throughout history, Those who dared to violate true sanctuaries often found themselves facing judgment of both earthly and divine varieties. The next 3 days in New Haven Falls brought changes that most residents didn't notice, but which transformed the quiet town into a chessboard where an intricate game of shadows was being played. New faces appeared in local businesses, their carefully casual demeanor betrayed by the way their eyes constantly tracked exits and sightlines. Unmarked vehicles cruised past St. Michael's at regular intervals, their tinted windows concealing occupants who studied the church's every detail. Father Thomas watched it all from his study, where multiple screens displayed feeds from cameras hidden throughout the town. The sophisticated surveillance system, built piece by piece over 5 years, now showed him exactly what their enemies wanted him to see, and several things they didn't realize were visible. "They're setting up observation posts," Marcus Wade reported, his prosthetic arm making soft mechanical sounds as he pointed to various locations on the displays. "Here, in the old Wilson building. Here, in the apartment above the pharmacy. And there's a team posing as construction workers on the water tower." "Good positions," Father Thomas acknowledged, his steel-grey eyes noting how the various teams were positioned to cover every approach to the church. "They've learned from the Raven crew's mistake. No blind spots this time." Sarah Chen entered, carrying fresh coffee and a stack of reports from her community network. The former administrative assistant had transformed over the past days, her natural organizational skills now focused on coordinating the complex defense of their sanctuary. "Latest count shows 38 confirmed hostiles in town," she announced, laying out photographs of various newcomers. Mix of ex-military, professional mercenaries, and some faces that match FBI watch lists for religious extremist groups, all of them heavily armed based on what's being smuggled in through the freight yard. Father Thomas studied the images thoughtfully. "They're building quite the coalition, different groups, different motivations, but all united in their desire to destroy what we protect here." "Speaking of protection," Sarah continued, "the renovations are complete." This was their code for the new defensive measures that had been quietly installed throughout the church. "Mr. Patterson finished the last of the electrical work this morning." The priest nodded, knowing that the elderly groundskeeper, a former combat engineer, had done far more than simple wiring. The church's ancient stones now concealed a network of sensors, countermeasures, and defensive systems that would have seemed more appropriate in a military installation than a house of worship. "And our special preparations?" he asked quietly. Sarah's expression turned serious. "The items you requested from the monastery arrived an hour ago. Sister Mary Catherine sent them herself, with a note saying she remembers what you did for them during the cartel crisis last year." That ghost of a smile touched Father Thomas's weathered features. The good sister has quite a talent for combining ancient wisdom with modern applications. Her incense proved quite effective during our last encounter. Michael Chen burst in, his young face flushed with excitement. "Father, they're making their move, some of them anyway. 3 teams heading for the rail yard, looking like they're prepping heavy equipment." The priest's expression sharpened. "Show me." The boy pulled up footage on his tablet, displaying several groups of men loading what appeared to be construction machinery. To untrained eyes, it might have looked like legitimate work crews preparing for a building project. But Father Thomas saw the truth, the careful way they handled certain crates, the military precision of their movements. "Demolition charges," he said grimly. "They're not just planning to raid the church this time. They want to destroy it completely, bury any evidence under rubble." "Can they do that?" Michael asked, his voice tight with concern. "Just blow up a historic church?" "They can try," Father Thomas replied, his voice taking on that deeper resonance that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the soul. "But they're forgetting something important about sacred spaces. They tend to resist destruction in unexpected ways." Detective Claire Morrison arrived next, bringing news from the police department. Chief's been pressured to reduce patrols. In this area, she reported. Orders from City Hall, apparently. Someone's pulling strings. Of course they are, Father Thomas said quietly. The corruption we're fighting goes deep. That ledger threatens people in high places. People who've spent years building a network of influence. Speaking of influence, Sarah interjected, checking her tablet. We've got movement in the financial sector, large transfers being processed through some of the same channels mentioned in the ledger. They're mobilizing resources. Father Thomas moved to the window, his practiced eyes scanning the town spread out below the church. The autumn sun was setting, painting the scene in shades of gold and shadow that seemed to hold deeper meaning. In the distance, more unmarked. Vehicles were arriving, taking up positions that would be tactically significant in the coming confrontation. They're not just gathering strength, he observed. They're sending a message. This display of force, this corruption of authority, it's meant to show that nothing is beyond their reach, that no sanctuary is truly safe. But this one is, Michael said with quiet certainty. Because of you. Because of what you've built here. The priest turned to study the boy thoughtfully. What I've built, he corrected gently, is just a framework. The real strength of this sanctuary comes from the community that sustains it, from people like your father, who believed in protecting something greater than themselves, from everyone who understands that some lights must not be allowed to go out, no matter how dark the world becomes. Sarah moved to join him at the window, her expression concerned. They have numbers, resources, and influence. What do we have? Faith, Father Thomas replied simply. Not just in the divine, but in each other. In the power of truth to overcome deception, in the strength that comes from defending what's sacred. His hand touched the silver crucifix at his neck. And perhaps most importantly, we have something they've forgotten how to recognize, the kind of power that comes from combining ancient wisdom with modern purpose. As if to emphasize his words, the church bells began to toll the hour, their deep tones carrying across New Haven Falls with haunting clarity. To most residents, it was simply another evening signal. But to those gathered in Father Thomas's study, it carried a different meaning, a reminder of the timeless rhythm that had sustained this sanctuary through centuries of challenges. Time to begin the next phase, the priest announced, moving toward a hidden panel in the wall. Behind it, gleaming in the fading light, hung an array of equipment that seemed to bridge the gap between tactical gear and religious artifacts. Michael, work with Marcus on final perimeter checks. Sarah, coordinate with our community network, make sure everyone knows their roles. Claire, keep playing the compromised cop, she finished with a grim smile. Let them think they've neutralized local law enforcement. And remember, Father Thomas added, his voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that had so terrified the Raven crew. What we're defending here isn't just a building or even a community. It's the very idea that some things remain sacred, that some truths cannot be buried, that some lights refuse to be extinguished. As his allies dispersed to their tasks, Father Thomas remained in his study, watching the gathering shadows on his surveillance screens. The enemy was indeed strong, well-funded, and determined, but they had made one critical mistake. They assumed that because they had corrupted some sacred spaces, all such places could be violated with impunity. They were about to learn why, throughout history, certain sanctuaries had endured despite all attempts to destroy them. Why some shepherds carried more than just spiritual authority, and why the shepherd, though he had found peace as Father Thomas, had never forgotten how to guide lost souls to their moment of truth, even if that guidance sometimes required methods that went beyond simple prayers and sermons. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across New Haven Falls. In the gathering darkness, St. Michael's Church stood like a sentinel on its hilltop, its ancient stones humming with both tactical preparation and sacred purpose. Inside, a priest who was also a warrior made ready to defend his sanctuary once again, knowing that the coming battle would require every skill he had learned in both his lives. The wolves were gathering in unprecedented numbers, but this time, the shepherd had prepared his flock for their arrival, and perhaps, just perhaps, some of those wolves would find themselves on an unexpected path to redemption, though the journey might be more dramatic than they had anticipated. As night fell over New Haven Falls, the church's defensive preparations entered their final phase. In the basement workshop that had once been a simple storage room, Marcus Wade made careful adjustments to what appeared to be standard security equipment, but which contained surprises their enemies wouldn't expect. Sister Mary Catherine's modifications are remarkable, he observed, testing a device that looked like a normal smoke detector. I've never seen someone combine medieval monastery formulas with modern chemical delivery systems quite like this. The good sister has many talents, Father Thomas replied, checking the seals on several small canisters marked with ancient religious symbols. She understands that protecting sacred spaces sometimes requires creative solutions. Sarah Chen entered the workshop, her tablet displaying new surveillance feeds. We've got movement at the train yard. They're unloading something big. Looks like pieces of industrial equipment, but the heat signatures are all wrong. Father Thomas studied the footage carefully. Thermobaric weapons, he said grimly, designed to create overwhelming pressure waves inside enclosed spaces. They're planning to breach the church's defenses and then use the building's own structure against us. Can we stop them? Michael asked from where he was helping Marcus calibrate sensor arrays. We can do better than that, the priest replied, that ghost of a smile touching his features. We can turn their own tactics against them. The church's ancient ventilation system, combined with Sister Mary Catherine's compounds and Marcus's delivery mechanisms, will create an environment they won't expect, Marcus finished, his prosthetic arm making soft whirring sounds as he made final adjustments. The same stones they plan to use against us will instead help protect what's sacred. Detective Claire Morrison arrived with Agent Diana Morrison in tow, both carrying updates from their respective agencies. FBI is being pressured to back off, Diana reported. Orders coming from very high up. Whatever's in that ledger has some powerful people, running scared. And local law enforcement's been completely compromised, Claire added. The chief just announced a training exercise that will keep most officers away from this area for the next 48 hours. Father Thomas nodded, unsurprised. They're isolating us, removing potential witnesses and interference. Standard tactics when planning a major operation in an urban area. But we're not as isolated as they think, Sarah reminded them, pulling up another screen on her tablet. Throughout New Haven Falls, small groups of residents were quietly preparing. Shopkeepers installing special locks, families relocating to safer areas, community members taking up strategic positions disguised as normal evening activities. Your father would be proud, Father Thomas said softly to Michael, watching the boy work with focused determination. He understood what we're really defending here, not just a building or even a community, but the very idea that some things remain sacred despite all attempts to corrupt them. The priest moved to a locked cabinet near his private chapel, opening it to reveal an array of equipment that seemed to bridge multiple worlds. Tactical gear, modified with religious symbols, modern weapons bearing ancient blessings, devices that combined cutting-edge technology with monastery-crafted components. Each of you has a part to play in what's coming, he said, beginning to distribute specialized equipment, some visible, some hidden, all essential. Remember, our strength isn't just in our preparations or our tactics. It's in our unity, our faith, and our understanding that true protection requires both physical and spiritual readiness. To Sarah, he handed what appeared to be a normal cross, but which contained sophisticated communications equipment. To Michael, a set of sensor controls, disguised as a simple tablet. Marcus received specialized ammunition for his security systems, while the Morrison sisters were given access codes to emergency protocols that would activate only if things went seriously. "Wrong. What about you?" Michael asked, noting how Father Thomas's priest's coat seemed to hold more than just spiritual authority. "I'll be where I'm needed," the priest replied, his voice carrying that deeper resonance that seemed to echo off the ancient stones. "Remember what I told you about shepherds. Sometimes protecting the flock requires meeting the wolves on their own terms." Outside, the night deepened as more unmarked vehicles arrived in New Haven Falls. Through their surveillance, they watched as professional killers disguised as legitimate workers took up positions throughout the town. The enemy's preparation was methodical, thorough, and would have been virtually invisible to normal observation. "They're good," Diana admitted, watching the tactical precision with which the teams moved. Military training, high-end equipment, solid operational security. "But they've forgotten something important," Father Thomas said quietly, his steel-gray eyes reflecting both tactical awareness and spiritual purpose. "Something that every warrior monk throughout history has understood." "What's that?" Michael asked. "That true strength isn't found in weapons or tactics alone. It's found in the perfect balance between physical and spiritual power, between modern innovation and ancient wisdom, between justice and mercy." The priest touched his silver crucifix, which seemed to gleam with both battle scars and divine promise. "They think they're preparing to destroy a simple church. Instead, they're walking into a sanctuary that's been preparing for them in ways they can't begin to imagine." Sarah's tablet chimed with new alerts. More teams arriving, more weapons being positioned, more evidence of the massive operation being mounted against them. But instead of fear, the small group felt a growing sense of purpose. They had spent years preparing for this moment, building something that was both a modern fortress and an ancient sanctuary. "Look at this," Michael called out, pointing to one of the surveillance feeds. Through the camera, they could see teams setting up what appeared to be signal jamming equipment. "They're trying to cut us off, disable our communications." That ghost of a smile returned to Father Thomas's features. "Let them try. Sister Mary Catherine's modifications to our systems include some rather unique solutions to electronic warfare. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones." As if to emphasize his point, the church bells began to toll the midnight hour, their deep tones carrying across New Haven Falls with unusual clarity. To most, it was simply the normal marking of time. But to those gathered in the hidden workshop, it was a reminder of the timeless power they were preparing to defend. "Time to take our positions," Father Thomas announced, moving toward the stairs that led back to the main sanctuary. "Remember, no matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, trust in our preparations. Trust in each other. And most importantly," his voice took on that otherworldly quality that had so terrified the Raven crew, "trust that some sanctuaries are protected by more than just physical defenses." As the group dispersed to their assigned positions, the ancient church seemed to pulse with renewed purpose. Modern security systems hummed in harmony with century-old stones, while tactical preparations merged seamlessly with sacred purpose. In his study, Father Thomas made one final check of their defenses, his movements holding that fluid grace that suggested both warriors' training and priests' devotion. The wolves were indeed gathering in unprecedented numbers, armed with weapons and technologies designed to overcome any normal defense. But St. Michael's Church had long since transcended normal categories, becoming something that combined the best of multiple traditions. a sanctuary capable of protecting itself, a sacred space that could meet modern threats with both ancient wisdom and contemporary innovation. And at its heart, a shepherd who had learned to walk in both light. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at the workshop entrance, her military bearing more evident now that there was no need to maintain civilian appearances. "Latest report from the Asian headquarters," she announced. "They're setting up sniper positions in the abandoned clock tower, high-end equipment, probably ex-special forces." "Show me," Father Thomas requested, moving to the surveillance screens. Through their cameras, they could see the precision with which the enemy snipers established their positions. Their movements were professional, methodical, suggesting extensive training and experience, but there was something else in their behavior, a nervousness that seemed at odds with their obvious skill. "They're afraid," Michael observed, surprising. "The others with his insight. Not of us exactly, but of this place." "Good instincts," Father Thomas approved. "They've heard stories about what happened to the Raven crew, about how an entire tactical team was systematically dismantled by seemingly impossible means. Now they're wondering if those stories were true." "Are they?" Claire asked quietly. "The stories, I mean. Some of my officers swear they saw things that night that couldn't be explained. Shadows moving against the wind, smoke that seemed to have a mind of its own." That ghost of a smile touched the priest's features. "The human mind sees what it expects to see, detective, especially in moments of stress or fear. Though," he added thoughtfully, "Sister Mary Catherine's compounds do have some rather unique properties when combined with the right environmental conditions." Marcus Wade looked up from his work, his prosthetic arm holding a device that seemed to combine modern electronics with elements that appeared almost medieval. "Speaking of unique properties, the modifications to the church's ventilation system are complete. If they try to use those thermobaric weapons, the pressure waves will be redirected through channels built into the very stones," Father Thomas finished. "Combined with Sister Mary Catherine's special incense, it should create an environment that will make our previous encounter seem almost straightforward." Sarah's tablet chimed with new alerts. "More movement at the freight yard. They're bringing in what looks like medical equipment, mobile treatment stations, trauma kits. They're preparing for casualties," Diana noted grimly. "They expect this to get messy." "It doesn't have to," Father Thomas said softly, his steel-grey eyes distant. "They still have the choice to walk away, to seek redemption rather than destruction. Though," he admitted, "I suspect they'll need to learn that lesson the hard way." Through the workshop windows, they could see the first hints of dawn beginning to paint the eastern sky. The enemy's preparation had continued through the night, transforming quiet New Haven Falls into an armed camp carefully hidden behind a veneer of normalcy. "Remember," Father Thomas addressed his gathered allies, "what makes a sanctuary powerful isn't just its defenses or its traditions. It's the faith of those who protect it, the unity of purpose that turns individual strength into something greater. Each of you brings unique gifts to this mission: tactical skills, technical knowledge, community connections, raw courage." He moved among them, checking equipment, adjusting positions, ensuring each person understood their role in the complex defense they had prepared. "But most importantly," he continued, his voice taking on that deeper resonance that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the soul, "you bring understanding that some things must be protected not just with weapons and tactics, but with conviction and faith. That some lights must not be allowed to go out no matter how dark the world becomes." The church bells began to toll again, marking the approach of morning. To those gathering outside with weapons and malice, it was perhaps an irritating reminder of the sanctuary they planned to violate. But to those inside, preparing to defend, what was sacred? It was a call to stand ready, to remember what they were fighting for. "It's almost time," Father Thomas said quietly, looking out over the town that had become his home, the community he had sworn to protect. The first rays of sunlight caught his silver crucifix, making it gleam with both battle scars and divine purpose. Remember, no matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, trust in our preparations, trust in each other, and most importantly, he paused, his hand resting on the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of prayers and protection. In that moment, he was both the warrior who had hunted darkness across continents and the priest who had found a different kind of strength in faith and community. Most importantly, trust that true sanctuaries have always been defended by more than just physical means, that sometimes the most effective protection comes from the perfect balance between modern innovation and ancient wisdom, between justice and mercy, between the visible and the unseen. Around them, St. Michael's Church seemed to pulse with renewed purpose, its very stones resonating with the combination of tactical preparation and sacred power. The enemy gathered outside with overwhelming numbers and superior firepower, not realizing they were about to face something that transcended normal military calculations. They were about to learn why, throughout history, certain spaces had remained sacred despite all attempts to corrupt or destroy them, why some shepherds carried both spiritual authority and tactical skill, and why the shepherd, though he had found peace as Father Thomas, had never forgotten how to guide lost souls to their moment of truth, even if that guidance sometimes required methods that went beyond conventional understanding. The first test of St. Michael's defenses came not with an explosion or an assault, but with a smile. As morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the sanctuary in colors that seemed to move with deliberate purpose, a man in an expensive suit walked up the church steps. His pleasant expression and confident bearing suggested a visiting dignitary or wealthy donor rather than a threat. Father Thomas, watching through both traditional and enhanced surveillance systems, recognized the visitor immediately. Victor Kane, former CIA operative turned private security consultant, now the public face for organizations that preferred to keep their true nature hidden from view. Right on schedule, the priest murmured, noting how Kane's apparently casual glance around the church grounds masked a professional assessment of security measures and tactical positions. "You know him?" Michael asked from his position at the surveillance controls. "We've met," Father Thomas replied, his voice carrying the weight of history. "In another life, when he still believed in serving something greater than profit, he was one of the good ones once." Kane's footsteps echoed off the ancient stones as he entered the sanctuary. His tailored suit couldn't quite hide the professional athleticism beneath, just as his diplomatic smile couldn't completely mask the calculation in his eyes. "Impressive place you have here, Father," he called out, his voice carrying easily through the space. "The Gothic revival architecture, the historical significance. It would be a shame if anything were to happen to it." Father Thomas emerged from the shadows near the altar, his priest's coat moving with that fluid grace that suggested more than just pastoral training. "The Lord's house is indeed precious, Mr. Kane, though I suspect you're not here for an architectural tour." "Direct, as ever I see." Kane's smile remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened slightly. "You know, when I heard the rumors about who was really running this little operation, I almost couldn't believe it. The shepherd, not dead after all, but playing priest in some small-town church. It seemed beneath your talents." "Perhaps I found a higher calling," Father Thomas replied quietly, "one that doesn't require compromising what I believe in." Kane's laugh held no humor. "Belief? Is that what you're calling it now? This elaborate setup, this— what was it the reports called it? This tactical sanctuary you've built." He gestured around the church interior. "We both know what this really is, a fortress disguised as a house of worship." You're half right, the priest acknowledged, that ghost of a smile touching his ill features. Though not in the way you think. This is indeed a fortress, but one that protects something far more valuable than mere physical assets. Through their hidden surveillance, Sarah Chen watched the confrontation unfold. She noted how other figures were taking up positions outside, professional operators, trying to look like ordinary citizens, going about their morning routines. They're setting up a perimeter, she reported through their secure communication system. Multiple teams, coordinated movements. This is just the opening play. Father Thomas had already noted the tactical positioning, just as he'd observed the nearly invisible earpiece Kane wore and the slight bulge of a concealed weapon beneath his perfect suit. The man's presence here wasn't just a threat. It was a message, a final warning before the real attack began. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Kane said, his diplomatic facade fading. You have something that doesn't belong to you. Something that could cause a lot of problems for people who prefer to avoid problems. Hand it over. Walk away from all this, and everyone gets to have a peaceful Sunday. The ledger, Father Thomas said softly. All those carefully hidden connections between corrupt officials, criminal enterprises, and seemingly legitimate religious organizations. A perfect map of how the wolves have been devouring the flock while pretending to protect it. It's more than that, and you know it. Kane's expression turned serious. That ledger doesn't just contain financial data, it has operational details, contact networks, evidence that could unravel decades of carefully built infrastructure. People very high up are very concerned about its contents. They should be, the priest replied, his voice taking on that deeper resonance that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the soul. Corruption of the sacred is a serious sin, Victor. Using houses of worship to hide criminal enterprises, twist legitimate charities into money laundering operations. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? Something flickered in Kane's eyes, not quite fear, but a shadow of uncertainty. He had heard the reports about what happened to the Raven crew, about the seemingly impossible events that had occurred within these walls. But he was a professional, trained to deal in facts and tactical realities rather than rumors and supernatural suggestions. Listen to me, he said, taking a step forward. You're an intelligent man. You know how the world really works. Sometimes maintaining order requires compromises, requires working with people and organizations that might not pass every moral test. The system you're threatening to expose, it serves a purpose, keeps certain balances in place. Balances built on corruption and fear, Father Thomas countered. On the exploitation of faith and trust. Tell me, Victor, when did you stop believing in actual justice? When did profit become more important than purpose? Kane's hand twitched slightly, unconsciously moving toward his concealed weapon. We're not so different, you and I. We both understand that sometimes the end justifies the means. Your methods during your hunting days weren't exactly by the book either. The difference, Father Thomas said quietly, is that I never forgot what I was fighting for. Never lose sight of the line between necessary action and simple evil. His steel-grey eyes seemed to pierce through Kane's careful facade. You used to understand that too once, before they bought your conscience with consulting fees and offshore accounts. Through their surveillance, they could see more teams moving into position around the church. Professional operators with military precision, carrying equipment that suggested they were prepared for a serious confrontation. The morning light caught glimpses of tactical gear and weapon systems that had no place in a peaceful town. Last chance, Kane offered, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Walk away. Let us handle this quietly. No one needs to get hurt. That ghost of a smile touched Father Thomas's features again. You're right about one thing, Victor. No one needs to get hurt. But walking away isn't an option. Not when what we're protecting here goes far beyond mere documents or evidence. Then you leave us no choice, Kane replied, his pleasant mask finally dropping completely. Whatever happens next, remember, you had a chance to prevent it, as do you, Father Thomas said softly. There's still time to remember who you once were, to choose a different path. Though I suspect, he added, noting the hardening of Kane's expression, you'll need a more dramatic reminder of what true purpose feels like. Kane turned to leave, his movements carrying the controlled precision of a man preparing for conflict. At the church door, he paused. You know what's coming. You know you can't stop it. Whatever defenses you've prepared, whatever tricks you used against the Raven crew, we're ready for them. Are you? Father Thomas's voice carried that otherworldly resonance that seemed to make the very stones hum with purpose. Are you truly prepared to violate a sanctuary, to face the consequences of such an action? For just a moment, something flickered. In Kane's expression, a memory perhaps, of a time when he had believed in more than just power and profit. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who had long since chosen his path. Consequences? He smiled without warmth. The only consequences that matter in this world are the ones backed by superior force. You'll learn that lesson soon enough. As Kane descended the church steps, the morning sun caught his expensive suit and professional demeanor, making him look once again like nothing more than a successful businessman concluding a meeting. But Father Thomas saw beneath the surface, recognized the message this visit was meant to convey. Through their surveillance systems, Sarah Chen watched Kane's security teams take up their final positions. They're not even trying to hide anymore, she reported. Multiple assault teams, heavy weapons, demolition charges. They're setting up for a major operation. Of course they are, Father Thomas replied quietly. Victor Kane doesn't do anything. Halfway, when he commits to an action, he commits fully. The priest's hand touched the silver crucifix at his neck, which seemed to gleam with both battle scars and divine purpose, though he seems to have forgotten something important about commitment. What's that? Michael asked, still monitoring the surveillance feeds. That true commitment, to faith, to justice, to protecting what's sacred, carries its own kind of power, one that transcends mere force or tactical advantage. Father Thomas moved toward his study, where final preparations awaited. They think they're ready for whatever tricks we used against the Raven crew, but they don't understand that what happened that night wasn't about tricks. What was it about? Michael's young voice carried genuine curiosity. The priest paused, his steel-gray eyes reflecting both tactical awareness and spiritual purpose. About reminding people that some spaces remain sacred for a reason. That true sanctuary isn't just about physical protection, but about the perfect balance between justice and mercy, between modern methods and ancient wisdom. Through the stained glass windows, they could see Kane's teams finishing their preparations, their movements suggesting the attack would begin soon. The morning sun painted their tactical gear in colors that seemed almost ironic, divine light illuminating instruments of destruction. Time to show them what that balance really means, Father Thomas said softly as the church bells began to toll the hour with unusual clarity. Time to remind Victor Kane and his masters why, throughout history, those who dared to violate true sanctuaries often found themselves facing judgment of both earthly and divine varieties. Kane's first assault wave hit St. Michael's Church precisely as the morning sun crested the eastern hills. Their approach was textbook perfect, multiple teams moving in coordinated patterns, using the oldest tactical doctrine of overwhelming force, applied with professional precision. But from the first moment, it became clear that textbook tactics meant little against what awaited them. Team Alpha, breach the south entrance, Kane ordered through their encrypted channel. Team Bravo, take the side chapel. Let's see what tricks our priest is waiting for. The response came almost immediately, though not in the way Kane had anticipated. As his teams approached their designated entry points, the very air around the church seemed to change. Sister Mary Catherine's compounds, released through the ancient ventilation system, created conditions that made veteran operators question their senses. "Sir, something's wrong," Team Alpha's leader reported, his professional composure cracking. "The smoke. It's not normal CS gas. It's doing something to our heads." Through their surveillance systems, Michael Chen watched as the highly trained operators began to falter. The sweet-scented smoke that filled the church interior wasn't just obscuring vision. It was forcing men to confront memories and truths they'd spent years trying to forget. "They're breaking formation," he reported to Father Thomas, who stood calmly near the altar. "Some of them are just stopping. Others are turning back." "Because they're remembering," the priest replied softly, his voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that seemed to bypass ears and speak directly to the soul. Remembering who they were before violence became their only answer, before they forgot what it meant to respect sacred spaces. Kane's response to this initial failure was predictably aggressive. "All teams switch to respirators. Whatever gas they're using, we push through it. Breach teams, prepare thermite charges. If we can't enter clean, we burn our way in." But even this tactical escalation played into the sanctuary's prepared defenses. The church's ancient stones, reinforced by Marcus Wade's modifications, channeled the heat and pressure in unexpected ways. The very architecture that Kane's men hoped to use against the defenders instead became another weapon in the sanctuary's arsenal. "Impossible!" one of the breach team leaders gasped as his thermite charge created patterns of fire that moved against natural laws, forming shapes that seemed almost angelic in the morning light. "Sir, this isn't normal opposition." "Father," Thomas's voice carried clearly through their tactical communications, though no one could identify how he'd accessed their encrypted frequency. "Still think this is just about superior force, Victor? Still convinced that nothing remains truly sacred?" Kane, watching from his command position, felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine uncertainty. He'd led operations against hardened military targets, terrorist strongholds, and supposedly impregnable compounds. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what was happening at St. Michael's. "All teams, push forward," he ordered, his voice carrying less conviction now. "Whatever tricks they're using, they're just that, tricks. No one holds against superior numbers forever." But even as he gave the order, more of his men were encountering phenomena that defied tactical response. The smoke that filled the church interior seemed to reach into their minds, forcing them to confront the moral weight of their choices. Hardened operators found themselves reliving moments when they'd chosen expedience over ethics, violence over virtue. "They're not just tricks, Victor." Father Thomas's voice came again, somehow both gentle and terrible. "This is what happens when true sanctuary defends itself, when sacred spaces remind us that some violations carry consequences beyond the physical realm." Through their surveillance feeds, Sarah Chen tracked the attackers' increasing disarray. "The northern team is in full retreat," she reported. "The eastern team has stopped advancing entirely. They appear to be praying." Marcus Wade's voice came through their secure channel, his tone reflecting professional appreciation. "The compound's interaction with my modified defense systems is exceeding expectations. The psychological impact is exponentially higher than our simulations suggested, because we're not just defending stone and mortar," Father Thomas replied, moving through the smoke-filled sanctuary with that impossible grace that suggested more than human movement. "We're protecting something that transcends physical structure, the very idea of sanctuary itself." Kane, watching his careful plans dissolve into chaos, made the decision that had been inevitable from the start. "All teams, hold position," he ordered, checking his own tactical gear. "I'm going in personally. Sometimes you have to show them how it's done." As he approached the church's main entrance, Kane projected every ounce of the confidence that had made him legendary in covert operations. But with each step closer to the sanctuary's threshold, that confidence began to waver. The morning light, through the stained glass windows, created patterns that seemed to move with deliberate purpose, while the sweet-scented smoke carried memories he'd spent years trying to forget. "Face me yourself," he called out, his voice echoing off the ancient stones. "Stop hiding behind your tricks and face me like a professional." Hiding? Father Thomas's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "I'm exactly where I've always been, Victor, standing between the sacred and those who would violate it, between light and darkness, between justice and corruption." The smoke swirled with apparent intelligence, forming shapes that Kane's tactical training insisted couldn't be real. Figures that resembled both warriors and angels, movements that defied normal physics, patterns that spoke to something deeper than mere physical perception. "This isn't possible," Kane muttered, his weapon feeling suddenly inadequate in trembling hands. "This is just elaborate staging, psychological warfare." "Is it?" Father Thomas emerged from the smoke like a figure from ancient legend, his priest's coat moving with that fluid grace that suggested both tactical training and divine purpose. "Or is it something your modern tactical doctrine can't quite explain? Something that reminds you of truths you've tried to forget?" Around them, the last of Kane's teams were either retreating in disorder or lying unconscious, overcome by combinations of tactical precision and spiritual warfare that their training hadn't prepared them for. The morning light through the stained glass windows intensified, creating patterns that seemed to pass judgment on those who dared to violate this sacred space. "What are you?" Kane demanded, his professional composure cracking entirely as the smoke brought forth memories of who he'd once been. A young operative who believed in justice, in protecting the innocent, in serving something greater than profit. "I am what I've always been," Father Thomas replied, his steel-grey eyes reflecting both tactical awareness and spiritual purpose. "A shepherd who guides lost souls home, even if that guidance sometimes requires methods beyond normal understanding. The real question, Victor, is what are you? What have you become? And more importantly, what will you choose to be now?" The morning light caught Father Thomas's silver crucifix, making it gleam with both battle scars and divine promise. In that moment, Kane faced not just a tactical opponent, but a mirror that showed him the full weight of his choices, the complete cost of his compromises, and somewhere in the gathering chaos, as Sister Mary Catherine's compounds worked their mysterious purpose, and Marcus Wade's defenses turned the very stones into weapons of psychological warfare, a battle was being fought not just for a church or a ledger, but for the very concept of sanctuary itself, a battle that would remind everyone involved why, throughout history, those who dared to violate sacred spaces often found themselves facing judgment of both earthly and divine varieties. "Team Delta report," Kane barked into his comm system, watching another group of his elite operators stumble back from the church's perimeter. "What exactly are you seeing in there?" The response came fragmented, the operator's voice shaking, with uncharacteristic emotion. "It's, sir, the smoke's doing something to our minds. I keep seeing faces, people we've hurt, operations that went too far, and there's movement in here that doesn't make sense. Shadows that move against the light, figures that appear and disappear." Through their surveillance systems, Michael Chen tracked the spreading chaos among the attacking forces. "Their formations are completely broken now," he reported to Father Thomas. "Some of them are dropping their weapons, others are... They look like they're having some kind of spiritual experience." Sarah Chen's voice came through their secure channel. Local police are maintaining the perimeter we established. Detective Morrison has them directing traffic away from the area. As far as the town knows, this is just a routine security exercise. There's nothing routine about this, Marcus Wade observed, monitoring the effectiveness of his modified defense systems. The compound's interaction with the church's architecture is creating effects I never thought possible. It's like the whole building is working with us. Father Thomas stood near the altar, his priest's coat moving in winds that shouldn't have existed inside the sealed church. "The stones remember," he said quietly, his voice carrying that otherworldly resonance. "Sacred spaces hold the weight of centuries of prayers, of faith, of hope. In moments like this, they can help remind people of truths they've tried to forget." Outside, Kane was rapidly running out of options. His best teams had been neutralized, not by conventional force, but by something that transcended normal tactical response. The sweet-scented smoke that filled the church interior seemed to seek out his men specifically, forcing each to confront their own moral compromises. "Alpha Team, move to position 3, he ordered, adjusting his strategy. "Prepare to deploy sonic weapons. Let's see how their smoke holds up against concentrated sound waves." But even this adaptation proved ineffective. The church's ancient acoustic design, enhanced by Marcus Wade's modifications, caught the sonic pulses and transformed them into harmonics that seemed almost like Gregorian chants. The effect on Kane's men was immediate and devastating. "So we have to abort," his team leader pleaded. "The sounds, they're not just disorienting us, they're making us remember things we've spent years trying to forget." Through the stained glass windows, the morning light created patterns that seemed to move with deliberate purpose. Kane watched in growing disbelief as his elite operators, men who had faced down special forces and terrorist cells without flinching, were reduced to trembling uncertainty by mere light and smoke. "This is psychological warfare," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Advanced tech combined with theatrical effects, nothing more." "Is that what you need to believe, Victor?" Father Thomas's voice seemed to come from directly behind him, though. When Kane spun, he found only swirling smoke. "Is that easier than admitting that some things in this world still deserve reverence? That some spaces remain truly sacred?" The smoke shifted around Kane, taking forms that seemed impossible, wings made of light, figures that moved between shadow and radiance, patterns that spoke of judgment and mercy in equal measure. And through it all, memories he'd thought safely buried began to surface. "I remember you, you know," Father Thomas continued, his voice now seeming to come from every direction at once. "Before you chose profit over principle, before you decided that nothing was truly sacred, you were one of the best, Victor, someone who understood that protecting the innocent meant more than just following orders." Kane's tactical training warred with the evidence of his senses. His high-tech gear, his careful planning, his superior numbers, all meant nothing in the face of defenses that seemed to operate on multiple levels of reality at once. "Fall back to position 1, he ordered his remaining teams. "Prepare for—" His voice trailed off as he realized his commands were meeting only silence. The tactical network that had connected his forces was somehow offline, though his equipment showed no technical failures. "Your men are safe." Father Thomas's voice came again, closer now. "Some are sleeping, their dreams filled with truths they've been avoiding. Others are praying, remembering who they were before violence became their only answer. A few have simply walked away, choosing to face their conscience rather than continue this assault." The smoke parted momentarily, allowing Kane to see into the church's interior. What he witnessed defied his professional experience. His elite operators lay scattered throughout the sanctuary, some peacefully unconscious, others kneeling in apparent prayer. And moving among them, appearing and disappearing like a figure from ancient legend, was Father Thomas. "This isn't possible," Cain whispered, his weapon trembling in hands that had never been anything but steady. "No one can do this. No one can just remind men of their own souls." Father Thomas completed the thought, suddenly standing before Cain with that fluid grace that suggested both tactical training and divine purpose. "Just help them remember that some choices carry weight beyond the physical world, that some violations invite consequences that no tactical doctrine can prepare you for." The morning light caught the priest's silver crucifix, making it gleam with both battle scars and divine promise. In that moment, Cain saw something that his years of covert operations hadn't prepared him for: the perfect fusion of warrior and priest, of justice and mercy, of modern tactical skill and ancient sacred purpose. And in the swirling smoke that still carried Sister Mary Catherine's mysterious compounds, in the light that seemed to move with deliberate intelligence through the stained glass windows, in the very stones that hummed with centuries of faith and protection, Cain began to understand that he was facing something beyond mere physical opposition. He was facing the very concept of sanctuary itself, defended by a guardian who understood that some battles required both earthly and divine intervention to resolve. The confrontation between Cain and Father Thomas unfolded in a sanctuary, transformed by both tactical innovation and sacred purpose. Morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, creating patterns that seemed to move with deliberate intelligence, while Sister Mary Catherine's compounds filled the air with sweet-scented smoke that made reality itself seem fluid and uncertain. "You've lost this one, Victor," Father Thomas said quietly, his steel-grey eyes holding his former colleague's gaze. "Your men are neutralized, your tactical advantage is gone, and you're standing in a space that's reminding you of every moral compromise you've ever made." Cain's professional composure, maintained through decades of covert operations, was crumbling in the face of defenses that transcended normal tactical response. This isn't possible," he insisted, though his weapon wavered in hands that had never been anything but steady. "No one can do what you're doing. No one can just help men face their own souls," Father Thomas finished, that ghost of a smile touching his weathered features. "Just remind them that some choices carry weight beyond the physical realm, that some violations invite consequences that no tactical doctrine can prepare you for." Through their surveillance systems, Michael Chen watched the scene unfold with growing amazement. "His vital signs are all over the place," he reported, monitoring the biotelemetry from Cain's tactical gear. "Heart rate elevated, stress indicators maximal. Whatever he's experiencing there, he's experiencing the truth," Sarah Chen replied softly, "the kind of truth that strips away all the lies we tell ourselves." The smoke swirled around Cain in patterns that seemed impossible, taking forms that his tactical training insisted couldn't exist. Figures that moved between shadow and light, wings made of radiance, shapes that spoke of judgment and mercy in equal measure. And through it all, memories he'd thought safely buried began to surface. "I remember the man you were," Father Thomas continued, his voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that seemed to bypass ears and speak directly to the soul. "Before profit became more important than principle. Before you decided that nothing was truly sacred. You understood once, Victor. Understood that protecting the innocent meant more than just following orders or maximizing returns." Cain's response was instinctive, a burst of automatic fire that should have torn through his opponent at point-blank range, but the bullets seemed to pass through empty air, while Father Thomas appeared behind him with that fluid grace that suggested both tactical training and divine purpose. "Still relying on force?" the priest asked quietly. "Still convinced that enough violence can solve any problem? Look around you, Victor. Look at what your superior firepower and tactical doctrine have accomplished here." Throughout the sanctuary, Cain's elite operators lay scattered like fallen leaves, some peacefully, unconscious, others kneeling in apparent prayer, a few simply sitting in stunned silence as they confronted truths long denied. The morning light painted them in colors that seemed almost like divine judgment, while the sweet-scented smoke continued its mysterious work on their consciences. "Agent Morrison reports the perimeter is secure." Sarah's voice came through their secure channel. "Local law enforcement is keeping the area clear, though they're getting some interesting calls about lights and sounds from the church." "Let them wonder," Father Thomas replied softly. "Sometimes mysteries serve their own purpose." Cain attempted another attack, this time a combination of martial arts moves that had served him well in countless close combat situations. But his strikes seemed to move in slow motion, while Father Thomas flowed around them like smoke, his priest's coat swirling with that impossible grace that defied normal physics. "I trained you in some of these techniques," Cain growled in frustration. "Back when you were still with the agency, before you went rogue and became this holy man act." "Not an act, Victor," Father Thomas corrected gently, redirecting another strike with seemingly minimal effort. "A calling. A purpose that goes beyond mere physical combat or tactical advantage, something you used to understand before you lost your way." Through the stained glass windows, the morning light intensified, creating patterns that seemed to watch the unfolding drama like silent witnesses. The very stones of the church hummed with energy that combined centuries of faith with modern, defensive innovations, creating an environment that made even hardened operators question their tactical certainty. "The ledger," Cain said suddenly, changing tactics. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Evidence that could bring down powerful people, expose operations that need to stay hidden for the greater good." "Greater good?" Father Thomas's voice carried an edge now, though still tempered with mercy. "Is that what you call it when sacred spaces are corrupted for profit? When churches and charities are turned into fronts for money laundering? When faith itself is twisted into a tool for criminal enterprise?" The smoke shifted around them, and suddenly Cain found himself confronting memories in vivid detail, moments when he'd chosen expedience over ethics, profit over principle. He saw again the faces of those he'd betrayed, heard the voices of those he'd sacrificed for what he'd called necessity. "Stop this," he demanded, though his voice held more plea than command. "Whatever you're doing, whatever this technology is—" "Not technology, Victor," Father Thomas replied, his voice gentler now. "At least not just technology. This is what happens when modern innovation meets ancient wisdom, when tactical skill serves a sacred purpose, when a sanctuary decides to defend itself through means both seen and unseen." Marcus Wade's voice came through their secure channel. "The compound's interaction with the church's architecture is creating effects beyond our simulations. The psychological impact is beyond measurement," Father Thomas finished, "because we're not just defending stone and mortar here. We're protecting something that transcends physical structure, the very idea of sanctuary itself." Cain made one final attempt, drawing a hidden blade with the speed that had made him legendary in covert operations. But before he could complete the strike, the morning light through the rose window intensified suddenly, creating patterns that seemed to pierce straight through his tactical gear to the conscience beneath. In that moment of illumination, Cain saw himself as he truly was, not the sophisticated operative executing a necessary mission, but a man who had lost his way so gradually he hadn't noticed until it was almost too late. The blade clattered to the stone floor as he fell to his knees, overcome by the weight of realizations that no tactical training could have prepared him for. What happens now?" he asked, looking up at the man who was both priest and warrior, both justice and mercy incarnate. "Now," Father Thomas replied gently. You begin the real battle, the one between who you've become and who you were meant to be. He gestured around at the church interior, where other operators were slowly coming. Two similar moments of truth. Each of these men will face both legal consequences and spiritual opportunities. Some will choose redemption, others will remain lost. The choice, as always, is theirs to make. Through their surveillance systems, Michael Chen watched in awe, as hardened criminals and professional operators alike faced moments of profound transformation. It's like the church itself is helping them see the truth, he observed. Because it is, Father Thomas replied, his voice carrying that deeper resonance that seemed to make the very stones hum with purpose. Sacred spaces have always served this dual role, offering shelter to those seeking redemption, while standing firm against those who would violate what's holy. Sometimes that defense requires methods that transcend normal understanding. As the morning light continued to paint the sanctuary in colors that seemed alive with purpose, as Sister Mary Catherine's compounds helped men face truths they'd spent years denying, a different kind of battle was being won. Not through superior firepower or tactical advantage, but through the perfect balance of justice and mercy, of modern method and ancient wisdom. I could have helped you, you know, Cain said suddenly, his voice carrying the weight of realization. Back when you first discovered what was happening with the church networks, when you found out how deep the corruption went, we could have handled it differently. You mean buried it, Father Thomas replied quietly, hidden the evidence, protected the powerful, let the corruption continue unchecked, just like you've been doing for years. Through their surveillance feeds, Sarah Chen watched other operators experiencing similar moments of clarity. It's spreading, she reported. Whatever's happening to Cain, it's affecting his entire command structure. Even the perimeter teams are starting to remember what they once were, Father Thomas confirmed, his steel-grey eyes never leaving Cain's face. Before they chose to serve money instead of justice. Before they convinced themselves that nothing was truly sacred. The smoke shifted again, taking forms that seemed to draw from each man's own memories and conscience. For some, it showed moments of childhood faith abandoned. For others, it revealed the exact instances when they'd chosen to cross lines they'd once thought uncrossable. You don't understand what you're disrupting, Cain tried again, though his voice held more desperation than conviction now. The networks we've built, the balance we maintain, sometimes the world needs shadows to protect the light. Is that what you tell yourself? Father Thomas asked gently. That corrupting sacred spaces serves some greater good? That using churches and charities to hide criminal enterprises somehow protects the innocent? The morning light through the rose window intensified suddenly, creating patterns that seemed to pierce through all pretense and rationalization. In that divine illumination, Cain saw with perfect clarity the full scope of what he'd become. Not a sophisticated operator making necessary compromises, but a man who had systematically betrayed everything he'd once held sacred. Agent Morrison reports movement at the perimeter, Michael's voice came through their secure channel. Some of the backup teams are surrendering, just walking up to the police and turning themselves in. Because they're remembering too, Father Thomas explained softly. Remembering what it felt like to serve something greater than profit, to protect instead of exploit, to believe in something beyond mere tactical advantage. Cain made one final effort to resist, not with weapons, now but with words. The ledger, you don't understand what its release will do, the chaos it will cause, the systems it will disrupt. Sometimes secrets need to stay buried for the greater good. No, Father Thomas countered, his voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that seemed to make the very stones hum with purpose. Secrets like these fester in darkness, corrupting everything they touch. True healing can only begin in the light of truth. Through the stained glass windows, the morning sun continued its inexorable rise, painting the sanctuary in colors that seemed to hold divine purpose. Sister Mary Catherine's compound swirled with apparent intelligence, helping each man face the exact truths they most needed to confront. "Sir," one of Cain's team leaders called out, his voice shaking with emotion. We can't continue this. What we're seeing in there, what we're remembering, it's not just tricks or gas or psychological warfare, it's truth," Father Thomas finished gently. "The kind of truth that strips away all the lies we tell ourselves. The kind that reminds us that some choices carry weight beyond this world." Sarah's tablet chimed with new alerts, more surrenders, more operators laying down their weapons and seeking understanding rather than victory. The tactical network that had connected Cain's forces was dissolving not through technical failure, but through moral awakening. "Do you remember Kandahar?" Father Thomas asked suddenly, his voice softer now. "That village where we first saw how power could corrupt, how good intentions could be twisted into something dark. You made a choice that day, Victor. We both did. I chose to seek a different path, to find a way to protect what's sacred without losing my own soul." "And I chose expedience," Cain whispered, the memory suddenly vivid in the swirling smoke. "Choose to believe that the end justifies any means, that nothing is truly sacred if the price is right." The sanctuary seemed to pulse with renewed purpose, its ancient stones combining centuries of faith with modern defensive innovations to create an environment where such truth-telling became not just possible, but inevitable. "It's not too late," Father Thomas offered, extending a hand to his former colleague. "The path to redemption is never completely closed, no matter how far we've strayed. Though," he added with that ghost of a smile, "sometimes finding that path requires methods beyond conventional understanding." Throughout the church, other operators were coming to similar moments of decision. Some wept openly, confronting the full weight of their choices. Others sat in stunned silence, their tactical certainty replaced by spiritual awakening. A few had begun to pray, remembering words and rituals they'd thought long forgotten. "The compound's effects are stabilizing," Marcus Wade reported through their secure channel. "Whatever psychological and spiritual transformations it's catalyzing appear to be taking permanent hold. Because it's not just the compound, Father," Thomas replied quietly. "It's the space itself, the accumulated weight of centuries of faith and protection. We simply help these men become receptive to truths they've been avoiding for far too long." Cain looked up at his former friend and colleague, seeing now not just the tactical expert he'd trained or the priest he'd become, but something that transcended both roles, a guardian who understood that true strength came from maintaining the perfect balance between justice and mercy, between modern innovation and ancient wisdom. "Help me," he whispered finally, his professional facade cracking completely. "Help me remember who I was before I forgot what it meant to serve something greater than myself." "That," Father Thomas replied gently, his hand still extended, "in both tactical victory and spiritual offering, is what sanctuaries are for, to help lost souls find their way back to the light, even if that journey sometimes requires unconventional guidance." The morning light caught his silver crucifix, making it gleam with both battle scars and divine promise. In that moment, as the sweet-scented smoke continued its mysterious work and the ancient stones hummed with sacred purpose, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something beyond mere tactical resolution or spiritual awakening. They were seeing the very essence of true sanctuary at work, the perfect fusion of protection and redemption, of justice and mercy, of modern method and timeless truth. And in that holy light, even the most hardened operators found themselves confronting the possibility of transformation, of finding their way back to the sacred truths they'd abandoned in pursuit of profit and power. "There's something else you should see," Father Thomas said quietly to Cain, gesturing toward the church's side chapel. "Something that might help you understand why this place, why this particular sanctuary, needed to be defended so completely." Through the swirling smoke that still carried Sister Mary Catherine's compounds, they moved toward the small chapel. The morning light created patterns that seemed to guide their steps, while the ancient stones hummed with purpose beneath their feet. "Station 3, Michael Chen reported through their secure channel. "That's where your father prayed," Father Thomas confirmed softly. "The night before he discovered the truth about the corruption. The night before he made his final choice to stand for what was right, no matter the cost." Cain's steps faltered as understanding began to dawn. "Officer Chen, James Chen, he wasn't just a random casualty, was he? That traffic stop wasn't an accident." "No," the priest replied, his voice carrying that deeper resonance that seemed to make the very air vibrate with truth. "He found evidence of how deep the corruption went, how many churches and charities were being used to hide criminal enterprises. He came here to pray about what he'd discovered, to seek guidance about what to do next. Through their surveillance systems," Sarah Chen watched her brother's face as he monitored this revelation about their father. Michael's expression showed both pain and pride, understanding at last the full weight of his father's sacrifice. "James Chen chose truth over safety," Father Thomas continued. "Chose to protect what was sacred, even knowing the cost. His evidence helped lead us to the larger network, to the ledger that proves how far the corruption has spread." Cain absorbed this in silence, the sweet-scented smoke helping him confront memories he'd tried to bury. "I approved that operation," he admitted finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Signed off on eliminating a security risk. I never knew, never let myself know. Because knowing would have meant facing what you'd become," Father Thomas said gently. "Facing how far you'd strayed from the man who once fought to protect the innocent." The morning light through the chapel's windows seemed to intensify, creating patterns that spoke of both judgment and mercy. Throughout the church, other operators were experiencing similar moments of revelation, confronting the full weight of their choices and compromises. "Agent Morrison reports more surrenders at the perimeter," Sarah updated them. "They're asking specifically to speak with priests or chaplains. Some are already giving statements about operations they've been involved in, networks they've helped protect. Because the truth, once faced, demands to be spoken," Father Thomas observed. "These men aren't just surrendering to tactical defeat. They're choosing to confront what they've become, to seek a different path forward." Cain stood before the small altar where James Chen had made his final choice, where a father had chosen his children's future over his own safety. The tactical gear that had seemed so essential now felt like a burden, a symbol of how far he'd fallen from his original purpose. "I was like him once," he said softly. "Believed in something greater than myself, thought I was serving a higher purpose." His hands moved to remove his tactical vest, laying down the physical armor that had also been spiritual blindness. "When did I forget? When did profit become more important than protection?" "The path away from truth is usually gradual, Father," Thomas replied, that ghost of a smile touching his weathered features. "Small compromises that seem necessary, choices that appear expedient, but the path back that can happen in a moment of clarity, in an instant of true seeing." Through the chapel windows, they could see more of Cain's men experiencing such moments. Some knelt in prayer, others sat in stunned silence, all confronting truths that Sister Mary Catherine's compounds and the sanctuary's ancient power had helped them finally face. "The compound's interaction with the church's architecture is creating something unprecedented," Marcus Wade reported through their secure channel. The psychological and spiritual effects appear to be cascading through their entire command structure. Because we're not just affecting individuals, Father Thomas explained. We're helping them remember what it means to be part of something greater than themselves, to serve something beyond profit or power. Kane turned to face his former colleague, seeing now not just the tactical expert or the priest, but something that transcended both roles. A guardian who understood that true protection required both physical and spiritual strength. "The ledger," he said suddenly. "It's not just about money laundering and criminal enterprises, is it? It's about all of us. Everyone who chose to look away, who helped corrupt sacred spaces for profit, everyone who forgot what it meant to serve. Something holy." "Yes," Father Thomas confirmed quietly. "And its release will force many others to face the same choices you're facing now, to confront the truth about what they've become, about how far they've strayed from their original purpose." The morning light caught the priest's silver crucifix, making it gleam with both battle scars and divine promise. Throughout the sanctuary, the sweet-scented smoke continued its mysterious work, helping men face truths they'd spent years denying. "What do we do now?" Kane asked, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone stepping onto a new and unfamiliar path. "Now," Father Thomas replied gently, "we begin the real work. The ledger's evidence will expose the corruption, but true healing requires more than just revelation. It requires redemption, restoration, the slow process of rebuilding what was broken." Around them, the ancient church seemed to pulse with renewed purpose, its stones singing with the perfect harmony of tactical innovation and sacred power. Through their surveillance systems, they could see more operators surrendering, more hardened men choosing to face truth rather than continue fighting against it. "And us," Kane gestured to himself and his men, "what happens to those who helped create this corruption, who forgot what it meant to serve something sacred?" That ghost of a smile touched Father Thomas's features again. "That's what sanctuaries are for, Victor, to offer shelter to those seeking redemption, to guide lost souls back to the light, even if that guidance sometimes requires methods beyond conventional understanding." The morning sun continued its ascent, painting the scene in colors that seemed to hold divine purpose. In its light, tactical gear and weapons lay abandoned as their former bearers chose to face a different kind of battle, the struggle between who they'd become and who they were meant to be. And throughout it all, the ancient stones of St. Michael's Church hummed with the perfect fusion of protection and redemption, of justice and mercy, of modern method and timeless truth. A reminder that true sanctuary wasn't just about physical safety, but about offering hope to those lost in darkness, even if that hope sometimes arrived through unconventional means. Detective Claire Morrison entered the sanctuary cautiously, her trained eye taking in the scene of transformation before her. Professional operators, men who had spent years perfecting the art of violence, now sat in various states of spiritual awakening. The sweet-scented smoke still swirled through the air, helping each man face the exact truths they needed most to confront. "FBI teams are staging nearby," she reported to Father Thomas. "Diana says they're ready to take custody whenever you give the word. Though," she added, glancing at the men who now sat in peaceful contemplation, "she's never seen suspects quite like this before, because they're not just suspects anymore," the priest replied softly. "They're souls in transition, confronting truths they've spent years denying. The legal process will still need to be followed, but something more fundamental is happening here." Through their surveillance systems, Michael Chen tracked the continuing transformations occurring throughout the church grounds. "More teams are checking in from the perimeter," he reported. They're asking about confession times, about whether the church offers counseling services." "Of course they are," Father Thomas said, that ghost of a smile touching his weathered features. "Sister Mary Catherine's compounds don't just disorient or incapacitate, They help people see past their own defenses, confront the truths they've been avoiding. Combined with this sacred space, he gestured to the ancient stones that still hummed with purpose. It creates an environment where real change becomes possible. Kane, still kneeling in the side chapel where James Chen had made his final choice, looked up at his former colleague. "I remember now," he said quietly. "Remember when we first started in the agency, how we talked about protecting the innocent, serving something greater than ourselves? When did we lose that? When did power become more important than purpose?" "The corruption usually happens gradually," Father Thomas replied, moving to stand beside him. "Small compromises that seem necessary, choices that appear expedient. But healing can begin in a moment of clarity, in an instant of true seeing." Sarah Chen's tablet chimed with new updates. Local news is starting to pick up activity around the church. Social media's lighting up with reports of strange lights and sounds. We'll need to manage the narrative carefully. "Let them wonder," Father Thomas said softly. "Sometimes mysteries serve their own purpose. The official report will cite tactical, surrender, and psychological factors, the deeper truth that belongs to those who experienced it firsthand." Marcus Wade's voice came through their secure channel, carrying professional appreciation. "The compound's interaction with my modified defense systems is creating effects I never anticipated. The psychological and spiritual impact appears to be self-reinforcing, spreading through their command structure like divine intervention," Michael supplied quietly, watching another hardened operator break down in tears of realization. "Something like that," Father Thomas acknowledged, his voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that seemed to make the very stones hum in response. "Though I suspect Sister Mary Catherine would say we simply helped create conditions where grace could work more effectively." The morning light through the stained glass windows continued to create patterns that seemed alive with purpose, touching each person in exactly the way they needed most. For some, it illuminated memories of childhood faith abandoned. For others, it revealed precise moments when they'd chosen to cross lines they'd once thought uncrossable. "What happens to them now?" Claire asked, watching as more of Kane's men voluntarily surrendered their weapons, choosing to face their conscience rather than continue fighting against it. "They face justice," Father Thomas replied firmly. "Their crimes still require accountability. Their actions still demand consequences. But now," he gestured to where former operators sat in peaceful contemplation or quiet prayer, "they face that justice with understanding rather than resistance, with a desire for redemption rather than merely avoiding punishment." Kane slowly rose from his knees, his expensive tactical gear now feeling like a costume that no longer fit. "The ledger," he said, his voice carrying a new purpose. "I can help. Explain its contents, identify connections that aren't immediately obvious, help expose the full scope of how sacred spaces were corrupted for profit." "A start," Father Thomas acknowledged, that ghost of a smile returning. "Though true redemption requires more than just information. It requires a genuine commitment to rebuilding what was broken, to restoring what was corrupted." Through the church's ancient stones, they could feel the pulse of something both very old and entirely new, the perfect fusion of tactical precision and sacred purpose, of modern innovation and timeless truth. Sister Mary Catherine's compounds still swirled through the air, helping each person face exactly what they needed to see, while Marcus Wade's modified defenses ensured that the environment remained conducive to transformation rather than conflict. "You know what amazes me most?" Michael observed, still monitoring the surveillance feeds. "How each person seems to be experiencing exactly what they most need to confront. Like the church itself knows what each soul requires for healing." "Because it does," Father Thomas replied quietly, his steel-grey eyes reflecting both tactical awareness and spiritual purpose. Sacred spaces have always served this dual role, offering shelter to those seeking redemption while standing firm against those who would violate what's holy. We simply help this sanctuary express that purpose more effectively. The morning sun continued its ascent, painting the scene in colors that seemed to hold divine judgment and mercy in perfect balance. Throughout the church, former operators who had arrived as enemies now sat as seekers, their tactical certainty transformed into spiritual awakening, and at the heart of it all, a priest who was also a warrior stood ready to guide these lost souls toward whatever grace awaited them, even if that guidance sometimes required methods that transcended normal understanding. 3 months after the confrontation at St. Michael's Church, New Haven Falls had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The official story, carefully crafted by FBI press releases, spoke of a failed criminal operation thwarted by coordinated law enforcement response. But those who had witnessed the true nature of the sanctuary's defense carried a deeper understanding of what had really happened that morning. Father Thomas stood in his study, watching the autumn sunset paint the town in shades of gold and shadow. The surveillance screens that had once tracked tactical threats now showed a community transformed, not just by the exposure of corruption, but by a renewed understanding of what it meant to protect something sacred. The last of the indictments came down today, Agent Diana Morrison reported, entering with a stack of files. 37 high-ranking officials, 12 criminal enterprises, and 6 supposedly legitimate religious organizations. Victor Kane's testimony proved particularly comprehensive. "How is he?" the priest asked quietly, his steel-grey eyes, studying footage of his former colleague leaving the federal courthouse, where he'd spent weeks helping dismantle the networks he'd once protected. "Changed," Diana replied thoughtfully. "The prosecutors say they've never seen someone so committed to exposing everything he knows. He spends his free time in the prison chapel, apparently, requested books on religious history and ancient church architecture." That ghost of a smile touched Father Thomas's weathered features. Sometimes facing the sacred reminds us of who we were meant to be, even if that reminder comes through unexpected means. Sarah Chen entered, carrying fresh coffee and updates from their community network. The events had strengthened rather than weakened the bonds between St. Michael's congregation members, many of whom now understood they were part of something far more significant than just a local church. 4 more of Kane's former operators have requested to join the congregation, she reported. They've been attending services regularly since their release on bail. Marcus Wade's been counseling them, helping them understand what they experienced that morning. "And Sister Mary Catherine's compounds?" Father Thomas inquired. "She says the formula is ready whenever we need it," Sarah confirmed, though she suggests we pray we won't need it again anytime soon. Michael Chen looked up from his monitoring station, where he now helped coordinate the church's security systems with a deeper understanding of their true purpose. "The new security network is fully integrated," he reported. "Mr. Patterson insists on blessing each component before installation, says it's important to maintain the proper balance." "He's not wrong," Father Thomas acknowledged. "The physical and spiritual defenses need to work in harmony, something our recent visitors learned the hard way." Through the study windows, they could see the evening light catching the stained glass, windows that had been repaired after the confrontation. Each piece had been carefully restored, though now they seemed to hold an extra dimension of meaning, as if the glass itself remembered the morning when divine light had helped lost souls find their way back to truth. "The ledger's contents are still sending shockwaves through the system," Diana continued, checking her secure phone. 3 more congressional investigations were announced today. The Vatican launched its own inquiry into how criminal enterprises managed to infiltrate legitimate religious organizations. Because the truth, once exposed, demands to be fully revealed, Father Thomas said quietly. Though the real healing goes beyond mere legal consequences or institutional reforms. As if, to emphasize his point, they could see several figures entering the church for evening prayers. Among them were former operators who had once arrived as enemies but now came as seekers, their tactical gear exchanged for civilian clothes, their weapons replaced by prayer books and rosaries. Some of them still have nightmares about that morning, Sarah reported softly. Not about the tactical defeat, but about what they saw in the smoke, the truths they had to face about themselves, about what they'd become. Because Sister Mary Catherine's compounds don't just create tactical advantages, Father Thomas explained. They help people see past their own defenses, confront the truths they've been avoiding, combined with sacred space and divine purpose. He gestured to the ancient stones that still hummed with subtle power. It creates conditions where real change becomes possible. Detective Claire Morrison arrived with the evening's police reports. Though now she wore the badge of Chief Morrison, her promotion a direct result of helping expose corruption in the department's highest ranks. 2 more churches have requested our assistance, she announced. They're dealing with similar attempts at infiltration, looking to implement what they're calling the New Haven Protocol for protecting sacred spaces. And what did you tell them? Father Thomas asked, though. That ghost of a smile suggested he already knew the answer. That true security requires more than just cameras and locks, Claire replied. That protecting something sacred means understanding both physical and spiritual aspects of defense. Though, she added with a slight smile, I left out the part about smoke that helps people see their own souls. The evening light continued to paint New Haven Falls in colors that seemed to hold divine purpose. Throughout the town, people went about their business with a new awareness of what it meant to be part of a community that had chosen to stand against corruption, to protect what was sacred by any means necessary. You know what still amazes me? Michael said thoughtfully, watching the surveillance feeds that now showed a town at peace. How each person who was here that morning seems to have experienced exactly what they needed most to change. Like the church itself knew what each soul required. Because it did, Father Thomas replied softly, his voice carrying that deeper resonance that seemed to make the very stones hum in response. Sacred spaces have always served this dual role, offering shelter to those seeking redemption while standing firm against those who would violate what's holy. We simply help this sanctuary express that purpose more effectively. As night fell over New Haven Falls, St. Michael's Church stood as a testament to that eternal truth. Its ancient stones now hummed with both modern security measures and timeless power, while its guardian continued his unique ministry, offering hope to the lost, shelter to the seeking, and when necessary, demonstrating why true sanctuaries had always been defended by more than just physical means. The wolves will always gather, Father Thomas said quietly, watching as more people arrived for evening prayers. But now they know that some spaces remain sacred for a reason, that some lights refuse to be extinguished, no matter how dark the world becomes. The silver crucifix at his neck caught the last rays of sunset, gleaming with both battle scars and divine promise. Around him, the sanctuary pulsed with renewed purpose, its very stones remembering the morning when tactical precision had met sacred power, when lost souls had found their way back to the light through means that transcended normal understanding. And, somewhere in the gathering darkness, other shepherds began to answer the call, recognizing that in an increasingly chaotic world, some spaces must remain sacred, protected by those willing to walk the perfect balance between heaven and earth, between justice and mercy, between the visible battle and the unseen war. Your father would be proud, Sarah said softly to Michael, watching the boy who had inherited James Chen's gift for seeing patterns that others missed. Not just of what you did that day, but of what you're becoming. Someone who understands that true protection requires both physical courage and spiritual strength. The church bells began their evening toll, their deep tones carrying across the quiet town like a reminder and a warning, a reminder that some sanctuaries still stood, ready to offer both shelter and transformation to those who sought it, and a warning that those who dared to violate sacred spaces often found themselves facing judgment of both earthly and divine varieties, even if that judgment came wrapped in a priest's coat and guided by a warrior's hand. Father Thomas turned from the window, his movements still holding that fluid grace that suggested both tactical training and spiritual purpose. The evening prayers would begin soon, and among the congregation would be both long-time faithful and recent converts, some still wearing electronic monitoring devices from their pending legal cases, all seeking understanding of the truths they had confronted in sacred smoke and divine light. "Time for prayers," he said simply, though his voice carried that otherworldly resonance that remembered mornings when justice and mercy had met in perfect balance. Time to remind everyone that true sanctuary isn't just about physical safety or spiritual shelter. It's about maintaining that divine balance, about standing ready to defend the sacred by any means necessary. The sanctuary doors opened to welcome both old friends and former enemies, all now united in seeking something beyond mere tactical advantage or spiritual comfort. And at the altar, a priest who was also a warrior, prepared to guide them all toward whatever grace awaited, even if that guidance sometimes required methods that transcended normal understanding. For in the end, true protection of the sacred required both the shepherd's staff and the warrior's sword, both modern innovation and ancient wisdom, both justice and mercy in perfect balance. And in New Haven Falls, that balance had found its guardian in a man who walked between worlds, ready to defend his sanctuary by whatever means necessity demanded and divine purpose allowed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.